chair of the Global Governance Forum. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Nik Gowing, who will be our moderator in this session today. Nik is an award-winning journalist and news anchor specializing in foreign affairs. He was the leading news anchor for the BBC World News for 18 years. His extensive coverage on global events and crises has made him a trusted voice in journalism and winning him 2 BAFTA awards. In 2014, he founded the organization Thinking the Unthinkable, which is a project to assist leaders in understanding the threats posed by our turbulent and rapidly changing world. Nik, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be the moderator in today's session. I pass it over to you.
Augusto, thank you very much indeed, and welcome everybody. Yes, we are in unthinkable times, and I think my job in the next 90 minutes is to get us to a point where we can really have thought about time to think, rethink the United Nations. But we are really in the throes of tumultuous and sinister times that tragically will be remembered vividly for all the wrong reasons. And this is going to last a long time. The relative stability that we've increasingly taken for granted is simply unraveling. The very principles that drove the creation of the United Nations after World War II are now being put through extreme stress tests that it would have been hard to imagine at any point in the last 70 years. Stability is really unraveling on so many core tenets of the United Nations. Peace, preventing and ending deadly conflicts. Look what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, almost unreal. Improving the state of life for hundreds of millions of people around the world. Leading efforts to slow down and reverse the climate emergency and the reverse of the abuse of the nature of our planet. These are existential threats. And we have to ask, I think, therefore, and this has been brought together by the Foundation for Global Governments and Sustainability and the Global Governance Forum, ask the question about whether the United Nations is the right framing or is framed as it is to handle the enormity of what is happening. Much of this was already laid out in the Common Agenda in September last year by the Secretary General. That was well into the COVID disaster, with the global climate emergency, the state of the emergency becoming clearer by the day, by the hour almost. And now, of course, we've got the enormity of what is happening in Ukraine. So we need to examine with our guests today and with you as well, how much even a report like our Common Agenda is still relevant given the enormity of what is happening. And I remind you that the latest IPCC report on the 28th of February is deeply gloomy about what is happening with the climate emergency, with planetary boundaries being breached, with tipping points being passed far faster than anyone assumed and thought was possible. Even the scientists involved in all this massive work that's involved in the IPCC. So these really are tumultuous and gloomy times. And what we're going to do is invite the speakers. I want you to be involved as well. You can pose questions, make comments on the chat. I'll do the best possible to marshal whatever is coming in and pinpoint the person it needs to be aimed at. But each of the speakers is going to speak for 7 minutes. And what I'm going to do is introduce them each as I invite them to speak. So first off is going to be Augusto Lopez-Claros, who you've just heard from, who's the Executive Director of the Global Governance Forum, who's going to talk about global catastrophic risks and UN reform. And please get your ideas to me as fast as possible, because Alex in Vancouver is going to marshal them in a way which hopefully will mean we'll get as many on the agenda in the next hour and a half as possible. Augusto, why don't you take it away? You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Nik. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. You know that the UN Charter was approved in San Francisco in 1945, and it was a sort of compromise between the big powers and the other 45 or so countries that joined upon the signing of the UN Charter. In 2020, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. And one of the things that is really noteworthy is that the UN Charter has remained frozen in time. It has never been amended. Article 109 of the UN Charter anticipated the possibility of a review conference to amend the charter in light of changes in the global economy and in the world at large, but that conference has never taken place. So Article 109 is inoperative. What I'd like to do in the next 6 minutes is basically to take a look at the adequacy of UN and whether it is still fit for purpose from a particular perspective, which is that of the global catastrophic risks which cast a shadow over our future. There are sort of two different stages in assessing risks. One of them is sort of identifying the risks that we currently face. And here we have, risks from human action like weapons of mass destruction and climate change, which are the ones that come quickest to mind. We have natural catastrophes such as pandemics and others. We can make a long list. Some people on the more esoteric side think of solar flares and asteroids as being in the spirit of natural catastrophes. And then we also have emerging risks, artificial intelligence and sort of perversions of technology, the malignant uses of technology, such as, for instance, the utilization of viruses for weapons of mass destruction and so on. And then once one has identified these risks, the challenge, and this is what we have done at the Global Governance Forum, is to assess the magnitude of the risks faced by countries across the world and their vulnerability and resilience to different types of risks, and to develop metrics to measure this. And so what we have done at the Global Governance Forum, and Alex Greenall at the end of my remarks will share with everybody the report that we are just publishing, is we have built a kind of a country risk profile for 120 members of the United Nations. We have identified internal factors which reflect national characteristics on the one hand, things like the strength of domestic institutions, the prevalence of corruption, the quality of a country's health system, the soundness of economic management, issues income inequality, gender inequality, demography, and so on. Many of these risks are under the control of government and other stakeholders, and governments are in a position to do something about them. And then we have, as part of this country profile, we have global systemic factors. These are things that, by and large, may be outside the control of individual countries, especially small ones. And here we have climate change, we have biodiversity loss, natural disasters, environmental degradation, water scarcity, vulnerabilities in the global financial system, and so on, the longest list, nuclear and conventional weapons proliferation, and so on. And so what we do then is, having identified these internal risks and these global systemic risks, which are outside the control of authorities, we build an index that brings together all of this data and tells us something about the vulnerability and the resilience of a large number of countries. Right? Obviously, because of the different nature of the risks which we face today, as opposed to those which we faced in 1945 when the UN Charter was approved, our index contains a large number of environmental and exogenous factors. We are looking at things like wildfires and temperature change and pesticide use and air pollution and fossil fuel subsidies. We're looking at population growth and population density, military spending, the risks of countries invading other countries, such as Russia invading Ukraine, and so on. And the results of this work, are really highly illuminating. And I'd like to mention to you in passing, which are the 5 countries that our index says are the most at-risk countries in the world. And I hope you will agree with me that the index does a very good job of identifying these risk factors. The 5 countries that are most at risk in the world are Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Lebanon, and Mali. Right? And then, of course, because this is an index and it ranks more than 120 countries, we have the least at risk countries. And perhaps the list will not surprise you. Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, Finland, and Luxembourg. The purpose of this work is basically to allow us to assess, the readiness of countries to face the coming catastrophes that are on our way, because of our inability to address climate change, because of a very unsettled political environment, because the United Nations has become, I'm sorry to say, a somewhat dysfunctional organization, especially the Security Council, because of the veto power, because the UN Charter has not been updated and has not been modernized to reflect the momentous changes that have taken place over the last 77 years since the adoption of the Charter. The challenge that we face is, how do we modernize the United Nations? How do we amend the Charter in a way that will make the organization, that will empower the organization to find meaningful solutions to these problems that we have? The alternative, it seems to me, is that we will be overwhelmed by this global catastrophic risk, which I have mentioned, and the index very much suggests that. I think my 7 minutes are over, Nick. Thank you.
Brilliant. Augusto, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. Underscoring how do we change the United Nations in a way to empower the organization to find meaningful solutions to the kind of new risks that we now face. Let me encourage all of you still to be putting questions, putting thoughts, putting comments, because I will be injecting them as soon as you send them to me. So Augusto, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Let's now move on, secondly, to Maria Espinosa. Welcome, Maria. You're at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin at the moment, but you're joining us not just because you're at the Robert Bosch Academy, but because of your work with women, and also particularly because of your leadership positions within the government of Ecuador. And of course, you were the president of the UN General Assembly until 2019. You have a lot of expertise in the UN, in defense and security, on sustainable development, and so on. So you come to the table with an enormous amount of experience, including trying to make sure that the UN General Assembly had teeth and influence and could be operationally viable and have impact at critical times during that year when you were there. So 7 minutes for you, Maria. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Nick. And of course, thank you to the Global Governance Forum and Fox for bringing us together. I think that the discussion we're having today cannot be more timely. And the first question is, why is that we need to retool and rejuvenate the UN? Augusto was so clear when he said that Article 109 of the Charter has been kept frozen and very little discussion about any charter reform. But many intents, many attempts to reform the UN without changing the foundations of the UN Charter. But we see that the world we live in today is completely different of the world we had in 1945, starting by the very fact that when the Charter was signed, there were 51 member states, and today we have 193 member states. The geopolitical dynamics have dramatically changed from the Cold War and an unipolar world to a multipolar world of what I would call perhaps a variable geometry in terms of power and clusters of interest, emerging economies, the BRICS, etc. And we are experiencing, as we speak, the configuration of a new world order, a new security architecture, especially with the current war in Ukraine. So, and there are a wide array of new threats to human security. And Augusto provided a very thorough list, starting with disasters, climate, artificial intelligence, well, you name it, transnational organized crime, just to cite a few. So, and what has changed as well is the social configuration and actors worldwide. the emergence with the tremendous power of the private sector in all its diversity, especially the role of big transnational corporations, the emergence of a very vibrant and yet diverse civil society, the widening of the huge inequality gap, not only from income and jobs, but regarding, a transactional inequality on gender, ethnicity, you name it. In what I will call, what has dramatically changed as well, is this broken relationship between societies, the economy, and nature. And in climate crisis, the climate crisis is perhaps one of the clearest symptoms. Inequalities is another symptom of this dysfunctional relationship. The role of media, of information and communication, a communications revolution, social media, the new technologies and the digital age. I'm just citing this list because that's what tells us, that we need, and I wouldn't even say UN reform, because we have gone through different cycles of reforms within the UN, but a redesign, a retooling. We are ongoing a 3-pillar reform that started with the current Secretary General, but we have understood that it's not good enough. And here we have in front of us our common agenda. Perhaps it's not a perfect document, but it has indeed created a very vibrant, dynamic process of dialogue and conversation. That's why we're meeting here today. And I think that that's a very good starting point, having society, think tanks, grassroots organizations start thinking about the future of the UN. And I think this is absolutely critical. Our common agenda provides like a wide list of options, 90 proposals, and of course we have to distill them, and we have to make sense of and to have roadmaps, landing pads for all the proposals that are out there on the table, and not only within the Our Common Agenda report, but outside the Our Common Agenda report as well. One of the key issues is, why do we need the voices of civil society? And here, having been a government representative, I understand that the UN is mostly an intergovernmental space, but I think we need to make a fundamental difference between government and the state. Government is one element of the state, the agent, the administrator, the one that represents its peoples. And the state includes its citizens, parliaments, civil society. And this is very important to remember. Civil society, I think, has always had a key role in advancing the normative role of the UN. The peace movement regarding the disarmament instruments and agenda, the women's movement on the gender equality and women's rights normative scaffold that we have, etc. In here, I think that inclusion should not be a mantra that we keep repeating and continues to be, unfortunately, ad hoc, lacks a clear and predictable, space and mechanisms, etc. But it is critical to address the main deficits of the UN and the multilateral system, for that matter. The issue of ownership, of co-responsibility, of inclusivity, the issue of legitimization of decisions that are taken under the umbrella of the UN. It's also good for addressing the huge implementation deficit and challenge that the UN faces. It boosts the oversight and co-responsibility dimension of the work of the UN. And I think that, we have to be, very serious about these discussions. Same goes for the participation of parliaments, of local and regional governments. I think it is the way to boost and increase the traction of the UN. In here, I don't know how close I am to my time, but I think that there is a permanent tension between the intergovernmental nature of the UN and its what I would call transnational dimension. And what I mean by that is that we need to redefine the idea of national interest, because multilateralism is not about the bringing together multiple national interests. I think it goes beyond that. When we speak about the fight against climate change, the global health threats such as the current pandemic, et cetera, how we address and deal with our global commons. So I think that one of the key challenges here is to redefine the idea of national interest in the midst of a globalized, interconnected world, and to really look carefully at this tension between the intergovernmental nature and the transnational cross-boundary dimension of the role of the UN. And this is, of course, not only rethinking the UN, but rethinking multilateralism as a whole. I think that and sometimes we hear civil society just repeating, we need to be at the table, we need to participate. And I always think, yes, of course, we need a space, but what for? What is going to be our voice used for? And in the case of the private sector, there is an unresolved issue that is absolutely critical. So we cannot just simply replace the discussion of inclusion, legitimacy building, accountability, and co-responsibility, saying, multi-stakeholder approach. That doesn't solve the main debates. So these are basically my initial points, and happy to listen and respond to any question. And thank you, and back to you, Nik.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for keeping to time as well. Underlining that tension of the intergovernmental nature and the transnational necessities, finding a new definition for what is needed. Let me just give you a couple of quotes of what's coming in already on the chat. This from Eston from the Young World Federalist, showing the expectations there are still for the United Nations, envisioning a sustainable, just, peaceful world through a democratic world federation, a world run by humanity for humanity, providing equal opportunity to all on a thriving planet. I say that because they are great ambitions, but look at the reality that the UN is confronting at the moment. And secondly, which is a particular point, Maria, will come back to you, but one question here from Georgios Kostakos about Ukraine, if the UN Security Council is proving to be particularly weak, of a weak UN, can the UN be saved by decisions and actions through its General Assembly? It's a much more detailed question. Yeah. But I put that on the agenda for you to be thinking about, because there you have the reality of what's happening in Ukraine. And if I may put it, the idealism which was born in 1945, which was put there on the agenda by Eston. So those are the kind of comments already coming in. Let's go to our third speaker. Keep the comments coming in. To our third speaker, Arthur Dahl, who's president of the International Environment Forum. And Arthur, we want you to talk about climate change and a better format for global environmental governance, particularly look at the science and what the IPCC is coming up with at the moment. And you have 50 years of international experience in environment and sustainability. Share with us, do you have any optimism that the UN as a forum is the one which can still take it forward, given the nature and the speed of the environmental and climate emergency we're all confronting, as confirmed by the IPCC in Working Group 2 and now in Working Group 3 within a few weeks?
Well, thank you. And I'd like to follow up very much with what Maria was just saying by looking at this sort of specific question about global environmental governance as an example, sort of focusing in on what might be some of the approaches and solutions to the kinds of problems that you're all raising. I'll try to share my screen, and I hope this works effectively. Can you see that now?
Indeed.
Yes. So if we want to understand the process, we have to talk about what is governance itself? What is the purpose of governance? I'm an environmental scientist specializing in complex systems. And so I try to look at what can I learn about all of the difference of natural systems, about what is really the ideal kind of governance of a complex system. What are the principles of governance we can extract from this? And we can see with any such system, we look at things like efficiency and productivity and delivering services to the whole. And the principles could apply to almost any institution, a local or national government, a corporation, an association. But also we have to recognize that we have different dimensions of our human capacity to participate in governance. We have our physical capacity, we're basically an animal in one sense with animal feelings and desires. We have a rational intellectual capacity, we can use knowledge and education. And we have, you might call, a value of spiritual capacity, what motivates us to make changes and do things. And of course, the characters of good governance that come from such an analysis can say, well, look, we see things that are very complex, they're not uniform, there's unity and diversity. They have very high levels of cooperation and reciprocity. There's a distributed control with subsidiarity. It's not just centralized top-down management. Each entity has its place in the system with many specializations and each one integrated as some part of the whole. But anything that is excluded is a loss of potential of the system. So the system tries to find some role for everyone, everything. They tend to be self-correcting with our mechanisms. If they get out of balance, they come back into balance. They have learning, innovation, they're evolving to adapt to changes. They have emergent properties at higher levels of complexity. That we see the well-being of the whole more than some of the parts. So those are emergent properties. And for example, a big complex computer program, a coral reef, except it's my own specialty. We see how these things work in practice in a very practical way. But look at the values in the present systems of economics and politics. They're so very different today. There's the assumption that humans are naturally selfish and aggressive. And therefore, we feature only the physical or animal nature of man if he's not been educated with knowledge or with values. And these values are expressed as selfishness, as greed, as falsehood, lust, indolence, pride, violence, and now we see today war as an expression of that value system. And we see it in wealthy individuals, in the famous, the powerful, the autocrats, the criminals. So many of the things going on in our society are due to these selfish values. And of course, what we don't know recognize is that we've institutionalized those same values. Governance, national sovereignty is selfishness at the governance level. It's war, as the way of, defending your national interest. The veto at the UN is another expression of that. We see it in political systems where people are seeking power, the influence of lobbies, the vested interests, not the common good that governments should be serving. We see it in national economies where GDP is a measure of how much wealth, of how greedy that country has been, the growth in its financial wealth. We see multinational corporations, this is built into their legal charter to make profits for their shareholders, to build market value, to share dividends, executive salaries, competition, domination. The same sets of values are captured in the structure of the economic system. And this is what drives climate change, exploitation, social exploitation, because there's no governance for multinationals beyond what happens at the national level. So those values are driving many of the problems that we see with the environment. So what kind of environmental governance do we need for our survival? You've already mentioned the existential environmental threats of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, land and ocean degradation. The crises are interconnected. We've got to deal with them connected. We can't just do one in isolation. So we need some kind of a global environment agency to address these interconnected global environmental challenges and to protect our common good. It should be kind of polycentric governance, not just one giant, dominating system, based on the principle of subsidiarity, with a global environment agency as a global level institution that would have binding authority over certain essential areas of the planetary commons. We've already made proposals in detail for this in a paper we did a few months ago for the Global Governance Commission, which people can refer to if they want afterwards. But in it, we suggest we should have 5 governance functions. First, a knowledge provision function, because we need scientific advice. We need objective basis for taking such global decisions. Deliberative and legislative function, we have to be able to pass binding legislation for the common good with an equitable sharing of responsibilities to apply, leaving nobody behind. We need an enabling and implementing function to be able to orchestrate the global system for environmental management in a coherent global strategy, but allowing for diversity in regional, national, local approaches to respect those limitations. There's trust and justice building function to ensure accountability, to mediate, to settle disputes. And then finally, we need a learning and reflexivity function to learn from experience, to adapt to the complexity and uncertainty of a future that we cannot predict very well. So that's how really such governance should work at the global level. We see in achieving this better format for global environmental governance an institutional evolution of UNEP into a global environment agency within a polycentric system with authority to set global rules, norms, and values for collective security. UN Environment Assembly could expand its legislative function to adopt such binding legislation. But that legislation should apply not only to governments, but also to non-state actors like multinational corporations and individuals who today are powerful enough to launch thousands of satellites to build the network and so on, and create space junk everywhere with no kind of control. We need an independent global scientific advisory council with scientists from all the relevant disciplines, the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, to provide the objective basis for action. And then we need some supporting measures, safeguards to ensure national autonomy, individual initiative. We need to also think about modifying corporate charters to include service to the common good and environmental and social policy in addition to profit as their legal obligations. They escape from that today. We should build it into their charters so they can be taken to court if they're not being respectful of our global needs. Then we should empower communities and individuals at the lower levels with the capacities as well to leave no one behind and to apply this kind of approaches all down through the system from the global to the national and the local. So thank you very much. I hope this has stimulated some discussion this afternoon.
Yes, indeed, Arthur. Thank you very much indeed. Before we go to Harris, let me just put on the agenda a couple of comments already received from Khalil Hamdani about democracy, for example. We need to shift the dialogue away from democracy versus authoritarianism. And also from Lena G, there's no surname there, on corruption, saying that the UN is mostly funded by the US. So, of course, there's a bias and there is corruption. The question should be how to make the UN a truly independent organization. I'm going to be interested to hear, I'm going to ask a question to Maria shortly after we've been through all five of you, about what your feelings were, Maria, as you sat in the General Assembly, wondering how much this really does need to be reformed, redefined, reinnovated. But think about the answer to that, and I'll come to you after the next two speakers. Let's move on to Harris Gleckman, who is a board member of the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability, with many years on trade in particular, working in the UNCTAD office in New York. And Harris, you're going to talk about the global governance reform proposals from the Secretary General last year. Give us an assessment in 7 minutes of whether you think they were absolutely on the ball back in September of last year, and if you can, whether they are still relevant even now, literally 6 or 7 months later. Harris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Augusto, for hosting this event. Let me share my screen.
Yes, your volume is quite low, so speak up a little bit, can you?
I will do that.
Go ahead.
Let me get my screen properly showing here. Thank you. Right now in the UN and in the General Assembly, there's an ongoing debate that originated with the report of the Secretary General from last year, as you were saying, Nick, called Our Common Agenda. And what I want to do is to share a number of observations about the tensions around that scoping of the issue, because as you say, there are issues internal to the history of the organization, and there are issues which have evolved subsequently. By way of backdrop, the UN is a very fragmented body, specialized agencies in different areas, grown out of the approach from 1945 and afterwards. And we also have a major split between those like the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, and the finance, trade, and monetary bodies. Unfortunately, the Secretary General does not address these fractions, divisions, or the split between the operational policy side and its financial base. We do, however, suggest, that is FOGS, that there should be a new intergovernmental coordination arrangement, so that the governments at each of the governing bodies have a formal way of talking with each other about these cross-dimensional, multidimensional issues. Second backdrop, of course, is Ukraine, and that is changing and shifting the entire space. As you were saying, Nick, this provides the reality of this war is going to change a lot of what was in and the perceptions of what was in our common future. So I'm suggesting 7 battle lines in the discussion of our common agenda. One has to do, and I've been central to this presentation so far, is the scale of necessary agendas. I think it is the case that all the speakers are saying the changes that are necessary because the world has changed require very massive changes in the structure and the institutions to try to manage them. But to be fair, those in the General Assembly are more inclined for incrementalism. The Secretary General is calling for a United Nations 2.0, but a more limited role for intergovernmental bodies and increased outsourcing of leadership to multi-stakeholder groups. Foggs is recommending that we have to look at these mega crises in a quite different fashion. And there's a need for now a Security Council with some of its characteristics for non-military mega crises. And Yvonne will share a lot more about that. The second battle line is, where does the UN fit in global governance? The Secretary General endorses a new approach called network multilateralism as a part and a complement to stakeholder governance. In network governance, each organization, each government, each multinational decides what it wants to do. In this arrangement, the UN has a reduced role in setting goals and objectives for the entire system, for the world. Foggs thinks that it's necessary for us to think of a more central role for the intergovernmental system on major issues, rather than pursuing something called, this approach called network multilateralism. Third battle is between the intergovernmental leadership, as I've been suggesting, and the Secretary General and multi-stakeholder approaches. Secretary General is seeking greater authority for his office and a reduced role for the intergovernmental system. We heard in the report a call for a 2030 multi-stakeholder summit for the future. That is, even planning for and adopting a plan for the future was to be moved outside the multilateral and public in space, as Maria is saying, for engagement. Governments have brought that back into the UN proper, but that's the battle between the intergovernmental role and the Secretary General office and approach. Even the call for more multilateral, more multi-stakeholder groups. The result, the report, when it went to the General Assembly, was a complicated resolution, but it did result in a series of 5 two-day thematic discussions under the presidency of the General Assembly for understanding the role of the UN, of the General Assembly, of the Secretary General in the future. Fourth battle line is between, as I've been suggesting, multilateralism and multi-stakeholder governance. Our common agenda calls for 9 new multi-stakeholder groups on critical, important issues and no new intergovernmental treaties. Even a suggestion that UN Women, one of the newest established multilateral bodies, should be already turned into a multi-stakeholder body. From Foggs, our policy recommendations are that outsourcing governments is not a great idea, and we are strongly in support of greater government investment and engagement, and as a public space, as Maria was saying, for intergovernmental decisions. The fifth battle line and Maria was speaking to this directly, is between intergovernmental bodies and non-state actors. Secretary General approach is say, yes, we want inclusiveness, but they occur in multi-stakeholder partnerships. Fogg's and others saying is there should be greater inclusiveness. We share that crucial idea, but we are proposing constituency assemblies where each community is brought together as a formal part of the United Nations, an extension of what was the major groups out of the Rio conferences of 1992. And each of these could be 10, 20 of them, would respond to questions from the intergovernmental bodies, would dialogue with each other, and help develop a common position on tough issues where the decision-making is with the multilateral system. And the sixth battle line is over the vocabulary we're using. Now one hears everybody is a stakeholder. We seem to have lost citizens. We've lost constituencies. We've lost communities. And by using the word stakeholder to talk about religion, about women, about labor, lays the basis for saying multi-stakeholderism is a good way forward. There's a battle about what the word inclusiveness means, about what democracy now means at the UN. Before, as Maria was saying, there's the state and there's the government. The government goes to the General Assembly and to the governing bodies of the UN agencies, and there's a public space for engaging with them. Not so with multi-stakeholder governance and not so with network governance. What's the UN to look like in the future, labeled the United Nations 2.0? And other key fights over the choice of words to describe where we are today. So Nick, what I wanted to share with people is that out of our common agenda, you can see 6 different tension points affecting about the idea about how we should have a governance of the future. Are we at the right scale in our thinking? Where do we place the UN? How do we strike a balance between the Secretary General, outsourcing, and the multilateral process? Is there a role for multi-stakeholder governance going forward? How do we make inclusiveness a dynamic concept with potentially these constituent assemblies? And the choices of words that we use in this process.
Thank you.
Your key question to me at the beginning, which I will leave with, is that the process is very complex and dynamic, made more so by the fact that Secretary General has said we want to resolve these issues for the future in effectively 18 months, the end of 2023. Perhaps this should be 2025. Give us a 2-3 year period to move these ideas forward. And of course, the geopolitical realities of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has changed the dynamic of what can be discussed at the moment and how it might be possible to get agreement about this range of issues. Nick, I thank you very much.
Harris, thank you very much indeed. Underscoring not just that these are battle lines, but they are what you called tension points. I think you could say that many of these battle lines stroke tension points would be evident in many other organizations as well, which like to use different vocabulary in order to hide new realities. So thank you very much for putting that very much on the agenda. And do please keep the questions and points coming in if you're watching this, please. Let's move on immediately to the idea that there needs to be something more resilient. Should there be even a global resilience council? And we're joined by Yvonne Rademacher, who is a senior global governance advisor for FOG. She's joining us from Nairobi, Yvonne, and particularly your expertise in international disaster management for the last 20 years, mainly with the UN, but your professional focus has been on strategic planning and troubleshooting operational bottlenecks. Do you see operational bottlenecks within the United Nations?
I think we've seen them all. So thank you, Nick. Let me get into this question of the global Resilience Council, I mean, it's obviously very clear. We all feel it. This is a historic moment, and we need change. We need fundamental, drastic change. The UN Secretary General has opened a window of opportunity here for us by launching his report, Our Common Agenda, and has started the really much needed discussion on the future of multilateralism. So we here at Fox believe that it's time, that this is the time now that demands bold action and daring institutional change, not incremental reform based on the lowest political common denominator that guides decisions at the UN at the moment. So we've heard it many times and keep hearing it. Drastic changes and ideas are not doable, but we believe they are. They can be done, and it will be beneficial to all, even those who might believe right now that they will lose power with change. Throughout history, humanity has been inventive and adaptive to change. Along with this have come new institutions, new intergovernmental bodies, such as the UN itself. So in this spirit, I would like to present the Fox proposal for a global resilience council, which, just as a side note, was conceived before our common agenda was released. So just, I have a few visuals here that I would like to share with my PowerPoint. So let me share that right here. Share my screen there. And off we go, hopefully, there. Okay, so what is this Global Resilience Council that we're talking about? Just a second, let me go back here. So we often, as Harris already mentioned it, we often refer to it as the Security Council for Non-Military Threats, because we envisage it to have top global decision-making and enforcement powers, similar to those for non-military issues and very similar to those used by the Security Council. So the difference here is that we are looking at a different composition and a different way of working at this Global Resilience Council. The GRC for short intends to provide missing global leadership and overcome the current siloed, sectoral, and fragmented approach that we are so painfully witnessing with the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. So the Global Resilience Council would deal with complex, multidimensional mega crises of an economic, environmental, or health nature, just to mention a few. Right now, these are all dealt with by individual organizations in a silo. And we see that these crises really demand that we look at these in a connected fashion and not siloed and fragmented like this. So with this, we also, we hope that this Global Resilience Council would strengthen multilateralism by restoring global trust, checking boxes on multiple functions such as stronger coordinated global action, greater transparency and inclusion with the involvement of advisory, or also sometimes Harris just referred to them as constituency assemblies, and security style, council style enforcement powers. So one of the things that would make it very different is its composition. We would still look at it from an intergovernmental perspective, but it would have advisory assemblies of non-state actors that would guide in the decision-making and would have a consultative function. So very much in contrast to network governance that carries little accountability, we would like this new body to have enhanced government accountability through decision-making enforcement powers. States would be represented perhaps by population size or some other democratic arrangement that would do justice to big and small states. And states would ultimately make the decisions, but also be accountable for them. So these advisory assemblies or constituency assemblies would have to be consulted, and they would be representing diverse groups, such as the scientific community, parliamentarians, indigenous groups, youth, and so on. And so how would this Global Resilience Council actually work? So here is an initial idea. There are many thoughts on how it could function, but here's one. So once a non-military threat to human security is identified by a multilateral body, a response to which extends beyond the capacity of an individual organization, and thus requires an all of multilateralism, all of society approach, there could be then a referral mechanism to the GRC for action. And I mean, we would like to note here that as the Security Council, certain requirements would have to be met for the GRC to become involved. It will not deal with any issue that falls under the mandate of an existing multilateral body. So what I would like to show here, though, is very quickly the comparison between what is proposed right now in our common agenda with the emergency platform, that is the Secretary General's idea, versus what we are proposing here with the Global Resilience Council. So the main difference here is that the emergency platform is conceived as an ad hoc body that will be convened by the Secretary General with members he selects and time limited for a very specific crisis. It's not expected to have decision-making or enforcement powers. In contrast, the Global Resilience Council would be a permanent body with membership from the intergovernmental system, guided by the advisory assemblies made up of non-state actors. It's permanent in nature and ready to respond, and there would be no delay in times of crises. The advantage here would also be that it can help handle the complexities of these mega crises that we are seeing more and more now. So this is something that is the GRC in a nutshell. The title of my segment here was, and Nik, you asked me the question, in need of a Global Resilience Council, and our answer to this is yes, we need a Global Resilience Council. And I have two messages that I would like to put out there as a takeaway. So the first message that I would like to put here, also for discussion with the audience, is the proposals for new multilateralism should not be based on what is perceived to be a possible political deal based on the current status quo, but based on what is needed for the survival of future generations. That is number one, as a message that goes with the GRC. And the second one is that the Secretary General has just established a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism to exactly guide this process towards the summit of the future. And I would urge this board to have an open mind, to have the courage to think bold for the future, look at all of our proposals that we're discussing here and elsewhere, and explore all of this in the time that we have towards the summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Yvonne. With those two challenges, particularly on the GRC, the Global Resilience Council, I'm sitting here thinking how many of these remarks I've heard in the last hour would be applicable, certainly in the very successfully and very pointedly in the days before February the 24th. But now, given the enormity of what's happened and the absolute determination of what Putin has done, which is essentially to ignore the United Nations, to abuse the United Nations, and to simply say, I don't care about any of your principles, how much that can underpin much of what you have to think about going forward when it comes to reform or innovation, rethinking the United Nations. Would rethinking the United Nations prevent what many are beginning to already call essentially a third world war? Maria, I come back to that question, which I put to you about half an hour ago to think about when you're sitting there as President of the General Assembly 3 years ago. Were there many occasions where you were saying to yourself as a senior appointee for the presidency, this is not working, we've got to find a better way? Or did you find ways of making it work, even though it didn't feel it was working?
Well, thank you, Nik. And Nik, I would use your question to respond a little bit to the other questions that you have been posing, during the interaction and the dialogue.
Don't forget the specificity of what I asked about you sitting there faced by all these nations.
Well, what I can tell you is that I think that the power of the General Assembly is underestimated and undervalued. And it is because this binary, which is really, at the end of the day, is not true, saying that the Security Council produces the legally binding, decisions, and the General Assembly does not. And this, I would say, it's really not real. Unfortunately, we have to see that the Security Council, from a realistic perspective, is an instrument that the superpowers have put together to avoid confrontation among themselves to start with. So that's what history in these 76 years has proven. But it's really not solving the main security challenges of our times, and we have to accept that. And on the other hand, the General Assembly, which is seen as like the space for soft power in a way, has an enormous power, because it is where the normative and policy guidance comes. It is the General Assembly that approves the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Goals, provides really a policy guidance that the conventions, the Rio conventions, the implementation of the climate and the other environmental conventions, now that we are the whole human rights architecture. And it's mandatory for countries to comply with international law that emerges from the most democratic and universal body, which is the General Assembly. In this particular crisis in Ukraine, what happened is that using this magical resolution called Uniting for Peace, an issue that was unresolved and vetoed at the Security Council was taken up by the General Assembly and voted and adopted by the General Assembly. The General Assembly has a collective moral power, but also a very strong normative and policy role. That's why the president of the General Assembly, in my opinion, has tremendous power, because it has to rule, to decide, to convene, to act as an honest broker in situations of crisis. It has proven to be extremely useful. It is the most democratic body of the UN. Every country, regardless of size, military power, GDP, we all have the same seats, the same microphone, and the same button to vote. And I think that we should really, there is a process that the outside world does not pay attention, which is called the revitalization of the General Assembly, meaning, in other words, how to bring more power to this democratic body. We all know that
in the end, it didn't stop Russia and Putin deciding to go to war, as he was determined to.
Well, when the General Assembly came in, I think it is discussing. There was an emergency special session of the General Assembly to adopt a new resolution. I think that the General Assembly has a role to play, has a very important role to play. And I think that the Security Council has shown in this particular case and others that it really needs a profound reform. We have been discussing about reform in 20 years. We haven't achieved much, but I think that these spaces of conversation, dialogue, and creativity are the ones that are important at this time.
Maria, let's leave it there for a moment, because what you've done, and I asked the question before Christine put it, Christine Muller of the Wilmette Institute said, all these constructive suggestions and ideas to reinvent the UN require a global vision and a commitment to global solidarity. How could the current crisis be used to promote such a perspective? in a new UN system, should there be some basic requirement for members to embrace a world-embracing view? I put that to all 5 of you, but we've got 25 minutes to run. So what I'd like to do is encourage you all to answer in relatively short order, because there are quite a lot of questions coming in. Augusto, I'd like to come back to you because you put on the agenda that essentially the UN, quote, is a dysfunctional organization. Maria built on that and talked about the need to retool and rejuvenate. But I was very struck by one thing when you talked about the least at-risk countries: Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, Finland, and Luxembourg. What happens if there is a tactical nuclear weapon dropped in the Baltics? How would you recalibrate the kind of risk definition that you are now pursuing? In other words, even you have got to reform the way you think about risk, given the enormity of the unthinkable that is now potentially happening.
Yes, Nick. I want to approach your question by building on something that was said by Yvonne in her presentation, which is actually one of the themes of our global governance book, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. She was saying that in approaching UN reform, we need to think less about what is politically feasible and to think more about what the world needs, right? Because it is this approach of basically limiting ourselves by political feasibility that has led to this paralysis, right? And the fact that we haven't amended the charter in 77 years, right? For me, I think what we need to do is we need to go back to 1943, 44, early 45, when there was on the table a completely different structure for the United Nations. People like Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, Grenville Clark were arguing that the General Assembly, number one, should be established on a system of weighted voting, where instead of one country, one vote, which is the way it operates now, which I think has undermined its effectiveness, we would link the voting power of countries to some objective criteria, GDP, population, whatever, right? If you were to do that, you can actually do exercises. If you were to do that, you know what is the voting power of the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, current permanent members? Less than 2% in all 3 cases, right? If you were to do this, then what you can do is you can give the General Assembly some limited legislative powers, which at the moment it doesn't have, right? You can give it more power to legislate on the kinds of issues raised by Arthur Dahl. Give it jurisdiction over certain areas of the global commons. Unless we do this kind of retool, and then of course you have to do away with the veto power in the Security Council, which is offensive. A little historical footnote: when the veto power was introduced at the San Francisco conference, there was outrage in New Zealand, in Poland, in Mexico. The New Zealand Prime Minister had some very tough words to say about the veto power because he thought that it completely undermined the spirit of solidarity and democracy, which was created at the founding of the United Nations. It was because of his objections and his outrage that Article 109 was included, calling for a review conference. Unless we think this big, in these big terms, Nick, what I'm afraid will happen is that we'll have more of the same. We're going to have crises following upon each other. We're going to have climate change kicking in and causing calamities across the planet, and the United Nations will be impotent. And
well,
I think
can I just press you, Augusto, because what I was using is that example of the least at risk: Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, Finland, and Luxembourg, really as indicative of how even now, by the day, by the hour, you're having to redefine risk well beyond the definitions of risk up until Christmas, January or February. In other words, the very basis of the parameters that you're making a judgment, all of you, about how to rethink the United Nations are changing very dramatically and very dynamically.
Absolutely, Nick. I agree with you. I agree with you. It's the nature of the world that we live, in which somebody who operates outside of the realm of the rule of law creates these conditions for us. And I am afraid that we'll see more of this as well in coming years. This is a warning.
Yeah, because John Vlatsto of Democracy Without Borders, he's put a couple of questions, but I'm going to point you to one question. given the emerging axis of authoritarian countries, would it be more productive to start developing the urgently needed effective, accountable transnational governance amongst the world's democracies rather than the United Nations? Now, who'd like to come in on that? Yes, Arthur and Harris.
We addressed this at the end of our governance book, saying, ideally any intelligent community would call for a UN reform conference and bring about the changes needed. Clearly, the UN is paralyzed by these fatal flaws. We then said the alternative would have to be a UN replacement conference, where those willing governments who saw the need for it, if there was a great majority, could already create a better organization, get it up and running, give it a stronger independent funding mechanism, so it's not dependent on countries, any one country with global taxes funding it, and leave out those few countries that refuse to take part until they finally, you sort of offer to buy out, and merge with the old structure or let it collapse. We went through this for World War I and World War II already, and we're looking as though we're maybe heading towards another major crisis, as you've actually, which may mean that the whole system will collapse, and therefore we're saying, what do we build after that process of crisis and collapse that we're looking in the eyes at the moment? I'm sorry to see it that way, but that's the reality that we're facing. I sometimes say, well, maybe the best solution to climate change would be a nuclear winter for a few years to cool down the planet very quickly, and maybe in the longer term that would be at a better interest than any other solution that's tried at the moment.
We may be facing that more quickly than anyone would want to even consider. Harris.
Arthur, I'm not going to go along with that last suggestion. Nick, I think the issue that you're putting sharply on the table is that we have a massive anxiety that what happened to the League of Nations may be happening to what we built afterwards of the United Nations. And we have a very strong range of critiques of how the world is working, or rather not working in its governance. And I think our challenge going forward, and reflected in a number of questions, is with recognition of different kinds of power to begin to think about what kind of institutional relationships would work, what might contain militaries that we haven't tried, what might change the frame of reference for building an institutional relationship. There are suggestions that the next form of that kind of structure could be population-based. But I think that one of the things that FOGS would like to put on the table is that now is the time for us to be able to start to describe the new institutional structures that we need going forward. And as Augusto was reminding us, the UN didn't get born in one day. It started before the Second World War was even clear what the outcome was, in order to start thinking about its future. Similarly, the League of Nations core ideas preceded the formal discussions. So I think that where we are is to try to recognize the nature of these crises and start to describe what institutional structures might be possible to govern them in a different fashion. And I think that that opening is a powerful step that all of us can make in thinking about the next way of going forward, whether it is hinted at in the outcome of 2023's conference or in other similar panels and discussions around the world. Thank you, Nick.
I think I saw you nodding there. Yvonne.
Of course, I fully have to agree with Harris. I think that one of the things, Nick, that you are also talking about is that we are looking at existential threats, threatening humanity, human security. How do we approach that? And the governance structures that are in place right now are not really looking at these issues as a crisis. In disaster management, we have governance bodies or structures in place, management structures in place to manage a disaster. And right now, that system that we have is not that. It is not actually designed to tackle these mega crises. So we need something that is set up and fit for what we are looking at, the challenges that are coming at us.
I'll ask all of you, and I don't mind who jumps in here. It's driven particularly by a couple of questions here, which I don't really need to repeat, but about how there are many countries out there who are becoming more authoritarian, more nationalistic, less willing to listen to others outside. And at the same time, all of you and the SG's report from last September are saying we've got to change the way our organization runs. Is changing it, innovating, refining it, redesigning it, is that even achievable when the very nature of it is under challenge and is being almost weakened by the realities, whether it be climate emergency or whether it be now Ukraine, whether it be so many of the issues on development and equal societies and biodiversity and so on. There's so many challenges out there. Is this the time when you can effectively reform an organization like the United Nations, which is, if you like, become bedded down in the last 77 years? Augusto, I'm coming back to you because you use that word, the UN is now dysfunctional. Can it be made more functional at a time like this?
I think that it can, but not by tinkering at the edges, which is what we have been doing for the last 30, 40, 50 years, right? We have had these challenges before us. We have had the issue of nuclear proliferation. Climate change has been around already for several decades. We have problems of income inequality, which is becoming now a political problem, not just an economic problem. Now, unfortunately, the powers that be, the P5, other countries, whenever we come to the issue of UN reform, the reflexive response has always been, what can we do within the constrained political environment, right? And what can be done is very little to actually face up to the problems that we face. So it seems to me that we are at a moment in history of particular risk. If the UN, which is the one place where we discuss and we try to cooperate internationally on these global catastrophic risks, if the UN doesn't make a leap of imagination and go forward and reform itself and make itself fit for purpose, then it will become irrelevant, as the League of Nations became irrelevant. People will judge the United Nations by the way in which it is able to provide meaningful solutions to these problems. If no solutions are forthcoming, then it is de facto a dead organization doing some work at the edges. I agree with Maria Fernanda when she said that the General Assembly has had some important achievements. We have to accept that. They were very much involved in the process of decolonization. The entire architecture of human rights is actually emanating from UN General Assembly resolutions and so on. All that is true. All that is true. But at the same time, we have all these other challenges before us, and we basically are not confronting them. The Paris Agreement is not working. We are deluding ourselves into thinking that we are actually addressing climate change in a meaningful way. So if it is not the UN, where is it? We need China on board. China accounts for 25% of global emissions. We cannot solve global climate change without having China at the table. So that is my concern. And the Ukraine crisis has only highlighted, our current vulnerabilities and the extent to which the UN is basically not the kind of organization we need today to address these global catastrophic risks.
Let me pick that up with Maria, because Maria, your hand is up as well, and Arthur, I see as well. But you talked about a new definition, the need for a new definition, Maria, of national interest, and you point out the tension, your word, of the intergovernmental nature and the transnational relations. And I'm therefore coming back to the same question, which is, in this kind of environment, when there's an accentuation, a dramatic accentuation of differences between nations, how on earth do you achieve innovation and rethinking the United Nations, whether we call it reform or whatever, rebuilding, retooling? is it even achievable, or will it just end up as a kind of enormous swamp, diplomatic swamp, where nothing will ever be achieved and it'll go on for years at a time when the world is imploding?
Well, I think the discussion of national interest is very much connected to the discussion on sovereignty and what it means. And the issue is that we have learned that multilateralism is more than the sum of its parts. It's more than individual countries as defending their national interest. It has to be more because we are governing global commons and global public goods. And for example, let me give you a very concrete example on global health issues. What is national interest when we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? National interest is having everybody vaccinated, is vaccines for all beyond national borders, because no one is safe until everybody's safe. On climate, what is national interest for the small island developing states? In terms of massive migration, for example, national interest is to make sure that we achieve the net zero target that we have set for ourselves. That science is telling us loud and clear that we really need to get our act together in mitigation, but also in adaptation. So national interest is about doing everything possible for collective security and for governing our global commons. And there was a question on budget, Nik, if you allow me, and the budget of the UN and who brings more money to the UN, etc. But also, the UN needs, the way we speak about the UN, it's funny, the UN should do this and should do that. The UN is not a self-operating machine, it's not a robot. The UN is a man-made, I would say man-made because in this case, but let's say human-made institution, organization. It means that this profound retooling, structural rethinking has to come from the human society. It is our call. It is our collective power to make things happen. It is not only the responsibility, which is mainly the responsibility of governments, but it is the responsibility of societies. And we tend to be extremely prescriptive. We have a list, a menu of things to do to improve the UN, different bodies, different organizations, different institutions. But in my opinion, we are lacking tactics and strategy. And Augusto said we need to understand very well what is the political environment. While we're speaking now, there is a resolution that was passed in the General Assembly 2 minutes ago, about the humanitarian aid in Ukraine. I'm just asking you, just read the small font of the voting patterns there. There is a fundamental problem. I mean, you see that there are 140 votes in favor, which, okay, it's 2/3, more than 2/3. But what are the countries that have abstained or voted against a humanitarian resolution on Ukraine? Something is happening. Something fundamental is happening. And I think these issues have to be addressed, not only by member states.
Let me ask you, because we've got about 7 minutes and both Arthur and Harris want to come in at least. I'd like to put to you what Lorena Ocampos from the IMF has said, which really which expands what you've just said. That's the correct word I'm looking for, Maria. We are thinking about a united world with the United Nations institution, a product of 2 previous world conflicts. The invasion of Ukraine is showing us a split of the world. The West versus the rest, constituted by very important, mighty and mostly autocratic countries. She lists China, Russia, India, the Emirates, given what happened in the Security Council, that disregard democracy, climate change, etc., and want to play a different role. Now, she asks about whether you think that split could be solved and how. I'd like to put to you that that's a reflection of the way the world is moving at a time when you all want to rethink and redefine the United Nations and try and negotiate all of that. I put that into the mix in the last 7 minutes because Arthur and Harris, if you can be quite brief, please come in. Arthur first.
I think that we're touching on the other fundamental flaw in the UN Charter, that it is founded on national sovereignty. National sovereignty no longer exists in a globalized world. What we need is to change the discourse to recognize what we need is the preservation of national autonomy. The kinds of things that people put forward when they think of national sovereignty are only better protected when you have global security. There's no national sovereignty if a powerful nation can overrun a small one. And therefore, if we can help countries to see that their own best interest today is no longer in clinging to national sovereignty, but evolving their thinking to acknowledge that their national autonomy and independence and is best protected by strengthening our global mechanisms. Thank you.
Harris, thank you, Arthur. Harris, please come in.
I want to pick on two topics to conclude our conversation. One is that within the 2030 conversations is a debate about what is the global commons? What is the global public good? And I think at the heart of that is the core of what we're discussing is to create a new narrative that can provide the foundation for a different way of envisioning global governance. Of course, there will be those who want those terms to become market terms, but we need to use that opportunity to broaden the public discussion, as you were suggesting, Nick, for another conceptual framework for our going forward. And in that, I would share as part of Fogg's as a think and do tank to other in the scholarly community, this is what international relations programs, this is what the environmental programs at universities, this is what the effort to try and reconceptualize how we would like to deal with global governance should be front and center in the work and move the capacities of people to rethink the space that we need for going forward. Nick, thank you very much for leading our conversation.
Right, we've got 5 minutes to run. I'd like to ask the same question to all five of you, if I may. Let me do it in reverse order. And Augusto, when I come to you at the end, maybe you'd like to give some concluding remarks, because I think you need to conclude it rather than me, because you have assembled everybody and you can tell us whether you think that there is a chance that this can be achieved. My question is, can what you are all talking about be achieved? And if so, how quickly? And be practical about it if you can. It's easy to design stuff on a piece of paper, but trying to convince 192 nations, 193 nations to do this is going to be incredibly difficult. Yvonne, first of all, a minute each.
So
your microphone, you're on mute.
okay, there we go. So yes, so at least for our proposal, as far as what we are looking at, we believe that in the next 2 years, we can make progress on this. And we believe that the Summit of the Future is really going to be a key for us, for our proposal to be taken to the next step. So we believe it's possible.
It's possible, even in the current environment.
We think so because it's very clear that we are dealing with military threats, but we are also looking at all these other things that are affecting people. So we need to, yes, exactly, climate, COVID, health, economic problems that we are all going to see coming now. We are all feeling the pinch already. So, I mean, somewhere we have to have a body that looks at all of these other interconnected issues. Absolutely.
Harris and then Arthur. Harris first.
I think that in the next, by 2023 or the years afterwards, we could put in place a different way of dealing with gender issues, economic issues, health issues, climate issues that we have had in the past. I think some of the other bigger questions about the scope of global governance, we could put markers down now that can start that work as it started well before the end of the Second World War, thinking about the current arrangements that we have in global governance. Those are my two tasks going forward. Thank you, Nick.
If I can come in next, I think what we probably need to do is to look for some key, critical, focused issue on which all nations might be able to agree. And climate change may be one, because everybody is equally threatened and is all seeing the impact. And do like the European Union, It started with a coal and steel community. And they got, once the people could get some sovereignty and get a benefit, then they could gradually expand it. So if we can find some narrow focused area on which we can get agreement and get a breakthrough in terms of giving up some sovereignty for global legislation in that one focused area, that can lay a foundation of trust on which we can then build further steps forward in the future. So not do everything at once, but find some narrow breakthrough and then build on that. Thank you.
Being practical, how quickly and when will actually what is happening now around the world act as a motivator to achieve change, or will it act as a block?
Well, I think that it's
Maria, that's for Maria. Arthur, that's for Maria.
Oh, that's for me, Nick. Well, I think that in my experience, the power of middle-sized countries and group of friends on particular issues, like the group of friends on multilateralism, for example, they have a great traction. And I think that from the citizen side, from the We the People side, I think we need to strategize better. I think that we need to take, the proposals we have, the ideas we have, and strategize. I think that that's perhaps a little bit of the weak point. We are very smart and intelligent to say what is that we need to do, but the how becomes perhaps more complicated. And believe me, I am absolutely convinced. Pessimism and indifference is a luxury that we cannot afford. I think we need hope and optimism. We need to understand that we, the peoples, we do count on rethinking the UN. And it is very important that we engage, that younger generations are connected. And when I push so hard to have the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the UN, it was precisely what I was thinking about, to unleash a global conversation, a global ownership of thinking about the future of the UN. And we cannot let this crisis go to waste. This is not like one more crisis. I think that we have reached a tipping point, and we have the opportunity to use this tipping point to push for greater and more profound changes. The Summit of the Future, again, and I coincide with Yvonne, can be a benchmark or something to look forward to, but where we need to co-build narratives, strategies, and proposals together. Back to you.
I mean, I think I'd like to put to you that we have to be practical. And Thomas Slatis from FOGS writes here that whatever action that needs to be taken must be taken swiftly so as to address the present unraveling of the international rules-based system. And there's a bit more to come, I think, and increasing frequency of catastrophic natural events. These issues will not wait. In other words, speed is an absolute imperative and priority. Augusto, the last word to you, please.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. I'd like to build on something that Maria Fernanda said in a podcast that we did together a few weeks ago. She said, this is no time for incrementalism. And I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that statement. So where might the catalyst come for the kinds of major reforms that we need to empower the United Nations to be able to address all of these global catastrophic risks that we face? I think that climate change is going to do it for us in a kind of a perverse way that unfortunately will involve a great deal of suffering, right? At the moment, we are not addressing the problem of climate change. We think we are, but we aren't. We have, as you said, Nick, some weeks ago, in a climate emergency. I think that as the consequences of climate change unfold, I expect that there will be people out in the streets protesting. There will be people across the entire planet, whether from autocracies or from democratic governments, basically demanding our political leaders that there has to be a better way to run the world. And though that the suffering that will be associated with these calamities may well turn out to be the powerful catalyst that we need to finally prompt our political leaders to tackle all of these sacred cows, whatever they are. Veto in the UN Security Council is one of the biggest sacred cows. The alternative is that basically we will be submerged by crisis, interconnecting all of them. You know, climate change is going to catalyze with the global economy in very destructive ways. I know it's not a pretty picture. I know it's not a very optimistic scenario, but at least it sees light at the end of the tunnel. In other words, the crises themselves become the catalyst which forces upon our political leaders the kinds of changes that are needed. Let's not forget, the League of Nations was created as a response to World War I. The European Union was created as a response to World War II, as was the United Nations. It seems to me that we require that kind of deeply ingrained and sort of pervasive suffering before we actually gather the political will to do the kinds of things that we need to do and which we recognize intellectually.
Augusto, thank you very much indeed. I'm thanking everybody on behalf of you and the FOGs as well. So thank you very much indeed for being very disciplined, I have to say, but also very on point. And I think that's been very important for something which is so dynamic at the moment, but of such importance where the public will expect so much, building on what Augusto has just said. And I'd put, if I may, just one final point. I was very struck by Christiana Figueres saying that on the UNFCCC, that she thinks that there's a possibility that the rise in gas prices and oil prices could in its own way have a dramatic effect on how we consume energy in future, and therefore it's going to have a dramatic effect on the ability to achieve Paris, even though after Glasgow it didn't seem as likely as it might do now. So can I thank you on behalf of everyone? I don't know if anyone else wants a final word, but we finished virtually on time. Everyone was time respectful, and that made my job a lot easier. So thanks for being so sharp and on the ball and taking the questions. And thank you to everyone out there for asking the questions as well. I hope I managed to merge them with the points that were being made by the 5 speakers. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick, for being such a powerful and effective moderator. We were right to have asked you to do it for us. Thank you.